The sun hasn't risen yet, but the fields are already waiting. 18,000 acres of Louisiana farmland, stretching to the horizon in every direction. Cotton, soybeans, corn, and moving through the rows in the half-dark, men in white uniforms, watched by guards on horseback, rifles resting across their laps. This is Angola, officially the Louisiana State Penitentiary, unofficially the bloodiest prison in America, a title it earned and kept for decades. Built on a former plantation, still worked like one. More than 6,000 men live here. 85% of them will die here. Not because of their sentences, because Angola holds the largest population of inmates serving life without parole of any prison in the United States. So when survival is measured not in years, but in decades, the question isn't whether you can make it through your sentence. The question is, how do you stay human when the institution was never designed to let you? That answer looks different for every man inside these walls. Some find it in faith. Some find it in work. Some find it in a hierarchy of violence that runs deeper than any warden's authority. And some, the ones who survive longest, find a way to navigate all three. Stay with us, because the story of how men survive Angola is more complicated, more brutal, and more unexpectedly human than anything you've been told. If you've never heard what life inside Angola actually looks like from the inside, not from headlines, not from policy papers, but from the men who lived it, this video is going to change how you think about the American prison system. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on notifications. This is one you'll want to finish. To understand how men survive Angola, you have to first understand what Angola actually is. Because nothing about this place is accidental. The Louisiana State Penitentiary sits at a bend in the Mississippi River in West Feliciana Parish, surrounded on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by the Tunica Hills. It covers 18,000 acres, making it the largest maximum security prison in the United States by land area. To give that scale, it is larger than the island of Manhattan. It was built on land that operated as a slave plantation before the Civil War. After emancipation, the state of Louisiana leased convicts, overwhelmingly black men, to work that same land under conditions that historians have compared directly to slavery. The plantation's name was Angola, after the African country from which many enslaved people had been taken. The prison kept the name. That history never fully left. As recently as the 2010s, investigative journalists and human rights organizations documented prisoners, again overwhelmingly black, working those same fields for wages as low as 4 cents an hour. The American Civil Liberties Union described this in formal reporting as a continuation of forced labor. By the time most men arrive at Angola today, they already know the reputation. The prison held the nickname, the bloodiest prison in America, for much of the late 20th century. In the 1970s, stabbings were so frequent that the warden at the time reportedly said there was a murder every 3 weeks. Former inmates described sleeping with homemade weapons, shanks, tucked under their mattresses as a matter of routine. The physical layout itself functions as a psychological weapon. Angola is so remote that escape attempts almost never succeed. The river cuts off one direction. The swamp handles another. Even the few roads leading out pass through miles of controlled territory. Men who ran rarely got far. Several documented escape attempts ended with prisoners turning themselves in, exhausted, after realizing there was nowhere to go. This is the environment into which more than 6,000 men wake up every single morning. And in that environment, the first and most urgent lesson every new arrival learns is this: orientation matters more than strength. Longtime inmates who were interviewed by documentary filmmakers and journalists, including those featured in Wilbur Rideau's landmark prison publication The Angolite, which was produced from inside the prison itself, consistently described the same pattern. New inmates who arrived projecting aggression without understanding the existing social structure were the most vulnerable. Not because they were weak, but because they were unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous to everyone around them. Angola's internal culture operates on a system of social hierarchies that have evolved over decades. There are formal structures, the work gangs, the dormitory assignments, the trustee system, in which certain long-term prisoners are granted limited authority over others. And there are informal structures, relationships built through years of proximity, reputation earned through consistency, and a code of conduct that exists entirely outside the prison rulebook. Wilbur Rideau himself, who arrived at Angola at age 19 in 1962 after a conviction for murder, and who spent 44 years inside before his release in 2005, wrote extensively about this dual structure. He described Angola as a society unto itself, with its own economy, its own justice, and its own concept of honor. His writings, and the journalism he produced through the Angolite, represent some of the most detailed, documented accounts of Angola's internal culture that exist. What Rideau and others consistently described was this: survival at Angola was never purely physical. The men who lasted, who kept their minds intact, who built lives that had meaning inside those walls, were the ones who understood that Angola required social navigation as much as physical endurance. That navigation began the moment you crossed the gate. If you want to understand the economics of Angola, you have to start with a single uncomfortable fact. The prison runs on the labor of its inmates. And the men inside know exactly what that means. Angola's farming operation is not symbolic. It is functional, large-scale, and central to how the institution operates. Inmates grow vegetables that feed the prison population. They raise cattle. They harvest crops. The farm produces millions of dollars in goods annually. And the men doing that work are paid, in most cases, between 2 cents and 40 cents per hour, wages that have been challenged in court and criticized by human rights organizations for decades. But inside Angola, that money, tiny as it is, matters enormously. Because Angola's internal economy runs on exactly what you'd expect: access to goods, services, and safety. And the currency of that economy isn't primarily dollars. It's commissary credit, labor, skill, and information. Men who work in the kitchen have access to food. Men who work in the medical unit have access to medications that can be traded. Men who work administrative jobs have access to information about transfers, about disciplinary hearings, about which guards are likely to look the other way on a given day. In Angola's internal world, information is among the most valuable commodities that exist. Documented accounts from former inmates and journalists who covered the prison describe an elaborate and formal economy operating in parallel to official prison functions. Items as basic as a cup of instant noodles, a bar of soap, or an extra pair of socks carry real social and economic weight. Inmates who arrived with family support, who received regular deposits to their commissary accounts, occupied a materially different position than those who arrived with nothing. And arriving with nothing was common. A significant portion of Angola's population comes from Louisiana's poorest communities. Many arrive without family connections on the outside, without financial support, and without vocational skills that translate to the prison's internal labor market. For those men, the first years at Angola represent a period of acute economic vulnerability. The response to that vulnerability, as documented by multiple journalists and researchers who have studied Angola, typically falls into one of 3 patterns. The first, alignment. Forming relationships with more established inmates who provide protection and resources in exchange for labor, loyalty, or other forms of service. This arrangement carries obvious risks. The terms of such relationships are never formal, and the power imbalance is extreme, but for many new arrivals, it represents the only available option. The second, skill development. Angola has, over the decades, developed a range of vocational and educational programs that allow inmates to build legitimate internal value. The prison operates a hospice program, one of the first in-prison hospice programs in the country, in which trained inmate volunteers care for dying prisoners. It operates a rodeo. It has had accredited college programs and trade training. Inmates who can position themselves within these structures gain access to work assignments that come with higher wages, better conditions, and increased social standing. The third pattern, and the one that carries the most long-term cost: isolation. Men who refuse alignment and lack the resources to develop skills sometimes withdraw entirely, keeping to themselves, trusting no one. Former inmates who described this pattern in interviews consistently noted the same outcome. These men survived, often, but they paid for it in psychological terms. Years of total isolation in a confined environment produced documented, measurable cognitive and emotional damage. The Angola Rodeo, which has been held annually since 1965 and opens to the public, offers one of the clearest illustrations of how Angola's internal economy intersects with the outside world. Inmates participate in bull riding, barrel racing, and other events. They sell handmade crafts to the thousands of spectators who attend. For many prisoners, the annual rodeo represents their largest single economic opportunity of the year. Crafts made and sold during rodeo weekend could, according to reporting by the Marshall Project and other outlets, generate hundreds of dollars for a single inmate, a sum that would otherwise take years to accumulate at standard prison wages. What the rodeo also provides, and this detail appears consistently in inmate testimonies, is something harder to quantify than money: contact with the outside world, seeing civilians, being seen as a person capable of creating something, being applauded. For men who will spend the rest of their lives inside these 18,000 acres, that moment of being seen is not a trivial thing. There's a moment that happens inside Angola that no official report fully captures. It happens in the hospice unit. A man is dying. He has been in Angola for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. He has no family on the outside who will come. He will not die in a hospital with nurses and machines and people who knew him before prison. He will die in a room inside these walls, in a bed inside this institution. And sitting next to him, holding his hand, sometimes, or just present, awake while others sleep, is another inmate. A man serving his own life sentence. A man who volunteered for this. Angola's Inmate Hospice Program, formally established in the 1990s and recognized by the National Prison Hospice Association as a model program, trains inmates to serve as caregivers for dying prisoners. The men who participate receive genuine medical and palliative care training. They learn to manage pain symptoms, to provide comfort care, to sit with someone in their final hours. And they do it because, according to every documented account from participants, it gives their life inside these walls a meaning that nothing else has matched. This is one of the most documented and studied aspects of Angola's prison culture, and the findings are consistent across sources. Researchers from Tulane University, journalists from major publications, and documentary filmmakers who have spent time inside the hospice unit all describe the same thing. These men, inmates who will themselves likely die in this prison, have found in the act of caring for others a way to remain human. That impulse, the need to find meaning in a place designed to strip it away, runs through every survival story Angola has produced. Faith is the other major pillar. Angola's population is heavily Christian, and the prison has one of the largest inmate-led religious programs of any American correctional facility. The New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary has operated a campus inside Angola since 1995, offering inmates the opportunity to earn accredited Bachelor of Arts degrees in Christian ministry. By the early 2020s, according to the seminary's own reporting, more than 300 inmates had graduated from the program. But the significance of faith at Angola goes beyond organized religion and formal programs. In a place where a man may not control what he eats, when he sleeps, where he works, or when he is transferred, faith represents a domain of internal life that no correctional officer can fully reach. Former inmates who were interviewed in documentary projects, including the Emmy-nominated film The Farm, Angola, USA, which followed 6 inmates of the prison over a period of years, described faith not primarily as religious practice, but as a psychological survival mechanism. The belief that your life has value. The belief that what you do today matters. The belief that the version of yourself you can still choose to be is worth protecting. These are not abstract spiritual claims. They are, in functional terms, the psychological infrastructure that allows men to wake up in the same institution on the same 4 cents per hour pay and continue to choose something other than despair. And yet, and this is the part that is hardest to hold alongside the rest, none of this erases what Angola also is. The same facility that produced the hospice program also produced decades of documented abuse. The same walls that contain seminary graduates also contain men held in solitary confinement for years at a time. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and the ACLU, have filed formal documentation of excessive force, inadequate medical care, and conditions in Angola's restrictive housing units that they have described as torture. Albert Woodfox, one of the Angola Three, a group of inmates held in solitary confinement at Angola for periods exceeding 3 decades, became one of the most documented cases of prolonged solitary in American penal history. Woodfox maintained his innocence throughout and was released in 2016 after more than 4 decades incarcerated, most of it in solitary. His memoir, Solitary, published in 2019, offers perhaps the most detailed first-person account of what extended isolation inside Angola actually does to a human mind. Woodfox described the experience not as one moment of breaking, but as a sustained, slow erosion. Days that become identical. The loss of the ability to navigate social interaction. The way the mind begins to generate its own stimulation when no stimulation is provided. He survived, he wrote, through discipline, through political study, through the act of refusing consciously, repeatedly, to allow the institution to define who he was. That refusal, that specific, daily act of internal resistance, that, more than any program or policy, is what Angola's long-term survivors describe as the center of how they made it. What you just heard about Albert Woodfox, more than 40 years inside this system, more than 30 in solitary. That's one man's story. But it points to a crisis inside American prisons that goes far beyond Angola. If this video is opening your eyes to something you didn't fully see before, share it. It takes 10 seconds, and it matters. We'll be right back with how Angola's violence finally broke and what replaced it. The violence at Angola didn't end on its own. It was broken deliberately through a combination of administrative force, cultural pressure, and, in a detail that Angola's own history tends to obscure, the moral authority of its inmates. The transformation of Angola from what observers in the 1970s called the most dangerous prison in America to a facility that, by the 2000s, had dramatically reduced its homicide rate is one of the most studied institutional changes in American corrections. And it is also one of the most contested. The official account credits Warden Burl Cain, who took over Angola in 1995 and served until 2016. Cain's tenure is associated with the expansion of faith-based programming, the development of the hospice program, the growth of the seminary partnership, and a genuine reduction in documented violence. Under Cain, Angola became, paradoxically, a case study cited by prison reform advocates and conservative law and order politicians alike, each group seeing in it the evidence for their own preferred solution. But the inmate account of how Angola changed is more complicated. Reporting by the Angolite, the prison's own newspaper, which operated with remarkable editorial independence for decades, documented that the reduction in violence was not solely a top-down administrative achievement. The cultural shift happened because a generation of long-term inmates, men who had watched the bloodshed of the 1970s and 1980s, made a collective decision to use their social authority to suppress it. These were men whose own histories were often violent. Men who had arrived at Angola when murder was routine and survived precisely because they understood the logic of violence. And as they aged into positions of social authority within the prison's informal hierarchy, many of them, not all, but enough to matter, chose to use that authority differently. This phenomenon, documented in academic research on prison social dynamics by criminologists, including scholars at the University of New Orleans who studied Angola specifically, is sometimes called elder governance, the role that long-term inmates play in regulating conflict among younger prisoners. At Angola, where the life sentence population is so large that men in their 50s and 60s are common, this dynamic carries particular weight. The practical mechanics are straightforward. An elder inmate who commands respect, who has survived long enough to have relationships with both the formal administration and the informal inmate hierarchy, can sometimes stop a conflict before it becomes physical, not through threat of violence, but through social pressure, mediation, and the weight of accumulated credibility. None of this was official. None of it was sanctioned. It happened in the space between the formal rules and the lived reality, which is where most of Angola's actual social life takes place. What it produced, in combination with administrative changes, was an institution that by the 2010s looked, on paper, significantly safer than it had been. Homicide rates fell. Disciplinary incidents declined. The prison that had once been called the bloodiest was being cited as an example of what was possible. And then the critique arrived. Because what Warden Kane's Angola also produced was a specific kind of stability, one that relied heavily on the faith-based programming, on pastoral control, on encouraging inmates to understand their situation through a framework of personal sin and redemption rather than structural injustice. Critics, including formerly incarcerated people who wrote and spoke after their release, argued that Angola under Kane had traded one form of control for another, that the religious programming, while genuinely meaningful to many inmates, was also used as a management tool, that access to better conditions, better work assignments, and better treatment was, in practice, linked to participation in faith-based programming in ways that blurred the line between spiritual care and institutional manipulation. These critiques were documented in academic work and in first-person accounts by former inmates. They do not erase the genuine reductions in violence, but they add necessary complexity to any account of how Angola changed. What the story of Angola's transformation ultimately reveals is this. There is no version of making a prison safer that does not involve some form of trade. Safety purchased through religious conformity. Reduced violence maintained through elder social pressure. Programming offered within an economy that also pays 4 cents per hour. The men inside understood the terms of every trade. They made their choices within those terms, daily. That, the constant negotiation between what the institution offered and what it cost, is the specific texture of survival at Angola. Not dramatic moments of resistance. Daily, deliberate calculation. This is what the numbers say, and this is what they don't. Angola houses more than 6,000 people. More than 70% of them are black. More than 80% are serving life sentences. The median age of the population has been climbing for years because men arrive young and stay forever. Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the United States. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And Angola, at the center of that system, has become something that almost defies easy categorization. It is a place where a man can earn a seminary degree and die without ever leaving. A place where the hospice program is nationally recognized and the solitary confinement conditions have been formally condemned. A place where the annual rodeo draws 10,000 tourists and the farm work still pays 4 cents an hour. A place where men have built genuine communities, genuine meaning, genuine lives, inside walls that were built to contain them. For the men who survive Angola longest, the ones who have been there 20 years, 30 years, 40, survival stops being a physical question and becomes something else entirely. Former inmates who were released after decades inside, through rare sentence commutations, successful appeals, or the even rarer occasions when a governor intervenes, describe a specific disorientation upon release. The outside world, which they had been protecting themselves from losing connection to, had changed in ways they could not have fully tracked from inside. Smartphones, the internet, the collapse of neighborhoods they remembered, the deaths of people they had held onto in their minds as still being there. Norris Henderson, who was incarcerated at Angola for 27 years before his release in 2003 after his conviction was overturned, went on to become one of Louisiana's most prominent criminal justice reform advocates. In documented interviews and public speaking, Henderson consistently described his survival inside Angola as rooted in a single decision he made early in his incarceration: to treat his time inside as purposeful, not punitive. To learn, to teach others, to build something that would have value whether he ever left or not. That reframing, from enduring a sentence to building a life within constraints, appears in the documented testimony of Angola's longest-term survivors with striking consistency. It does not make the institution just. It does not make the conditions acceptable. It does not resolve the documented abuses, the racial disparities, the labor conditions, or the fundamental question of whether locking human beings in a former plantation for the rest of their lives serves any legitimate social purpose. But it does illuminate something about human capacity that Angola's most honest observers, including its own inmates, in publications like the Angolite, have consistently tried to document. That the human need to build meaning is more durable than almost any institution designed to suppress it. That is not an argument for prisons. It is an argument for people. The men inside Angola have been building lives in an impossible place for as long as Angola has existed. They have done it through faith and through labor, through violence and through its rejection, through education and through craft, through sitting beside a dying man and choosing to stay. They have done it with almost nothing. And that fact, that specific, uncomfortable, unresolvable fact, is the one that Angola's story forces you to sit with. What would those men have built if the walls had never been there? That question doesn't have an easy answer, and neither does the system that produced Angola and the dozens of institutions like it across the United States. If this video gave you something to think about, something to feel, something you didn't know before, subscribe, like, comment, and share it with people. That's how these stories travel. And if you want to go deeper, our next video covers the men of death row at Angola, how they spend their final years, what the data shows about wrongful convictions in Louisiana, and what happens in the hours before an execution is carried out. It's already up. Click it now.